On the 14th of May, 1796, Edward Jenner, whose father was Vicar of Berkeley, just up the road from where I'm speaking, tested his hypothesis that pus from cowpox blisters protected milkmaids from smallpox when he inoculated James Phipps, an 8-year-old boy who was the son of Jenner's gardener. You might like to know that the pus was scraped from the hands of Sarah Nelms, who had caught cowpox from a cow called Blossom. Jenner notes all of this in his journals. And Blossom's hide now hangs in St. George's Hospital Medical School. At that time, smallpox killed between 10 and 20% of the population and scarred most, which is why milkmaids stood out in all sorts of ways. It took until the 1970s for smallpox to be eradicated worldwide. And the final vaccinations took place in Bihar while I was working there and not as a vaccinator. There is also a fascinating backstory around Islamic immunology and the scientific nous of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, but that's for another day if I'm to keep my text to about 13 minutes. Today, some of us on screen will have been volunteers in the Oxford AstraZeneca trial or been vaccinated using a product designed at the Jenner Institute in Oxford, where the mother of one of our curates is Chief Operating Officer. And much of our conversation recently, I suspect, has been around where we fit between the different groups and the timetable of the vaccination programme, whether we are vaccinated by the AstraZeneca or Pfizer or other available vaccines. But back to Jenner and the priorities by which he steered, which he would have seen as Christian virtues. And he was deeply loved in his community, not just for his medical skills, but also because of his Christian faith and where that faith took him. He's buried in the place of honor next to the altar on the north side in Berkeley Parish Church. Jenner's motivation was rooted in his wonder at the creation which was gifted by God. He had huge curiosity about the natural world. He's remembered today as an immunologist, but he was elected to the Royal Society following his study of the life cycle of the cuckoo, describing how the newly fledged cuckoo pushed its host eggs and fledglings out of the nest, then describing how the fledgling's back was adapted to the task just for the first 12 days of its life. His observation of animals and their interaction was crucial in his thinking about vaccination, observing and then employing in vaccination transmission across the animal-human transspecies boundary. He had both extraordinary powers of observation and the ability to combine work across areas which in our day often form knowledge stored in separate silos. Indeed, he worked prior to the creation of those silos and was what we would now call a cross-disciplinary integrationist. And that was way before universities created that tag. More significantly, he also worked across the boundaries between social silos. Jenner's interest in immunology was sparked by the story he heard from a milkmaid in his early months apprenticed to a surgeon in London. That was after his training as a physician in St Andrews in Scotland. Now, many would have disregarded the thesis that a milkmaid would know anything about smallpox. Certainly not, except this milkmaid's thesis that she could not get smallpox. An unschooled farmhand, that sort of woman would not generally be attended to. And I love the fact that he recorded the names of each of the first vaccinated child in that trial, the name of the milkmaid, and the name of the cow. Here was a person who delighted in all that God had made and knew that it was good in all its detail. Secondly, Jenner was a determined and enormously patient pursuer of the truth. It was in the early 1770s that he was first alerted to the impact of exposure to cowpox and the incidence of smallpox. He published his findings only 30 years later, after a huge amount of further experimental work on disease processes, having carefully attended to the criticism of his peers. The medical establishment spent years deliberating his findings, and it was only after Jenner's death that the Vaccination Act provided smallpox vaccination free of charge. The long-term pursuit of truth and faith that there is a truth to be revealed was, in Jenner's Christian worldview, the consequence of a divinely created world order and a consequence of God being the source of all truth. Thirdly, Jenner attended to the gift of each creature and each person and the particular needs of children who were most prone to smallpox infection. He also attended to those with little wealth. He served a community with both a clear hierarchy and also a clear sense of mutual responsibility, of social bonds which required much of those to whom much was given. He enacted his compassion. He suffered with his community when he vaccinated his son in one of the earliest cohorts of patients. He continued to vaccinate in his practice free of charge. Many of the virtues Jenner displayed continue to form part of our nation's approach to the coronavirus. The virus is not only available free of charge, it cannot be purchased. Distribution continues to be based on vulnerability to serious disease and mortality, rather than on the basis simply of vulnerability to infection. But alongside all that, through the last 2 centuries, there have been those who have been vaccine hesitant, if not resistant, questioning the claims of scientists, those who for their own reasons have stoked those fears. The so-called white knights have talked up the vaccine threat, talked down the threat of disease, hinted at conspiracies and alternate truth claims. Andrew Wakefield was one of those whose fraudulent 1998 study reported an association between MMR vaccine and autism and led many, particularly expectant mums, to refuse MMR vaccination for their newborns. That work, I would argue, in Christian moral terms, profoundly wrong. There are, alongside those doubts, questions about the limits to generosity, particularly generosity in our global community. Jenner's boundary was, of course, set by that of his limited Gloucester practice. Interestingly, the medics who set up the Oxford Jenner Institute in the 20th century set up their unit because they were concerned for the welfare and well-being of those across the world. They sent young medics, including my husband, as it turned out, to work and learn in areas with new disease emerging and relatively under-resourced healthcare systems. And their focus was global need, and therefore the need for an agile response to new diseases wherever they emerged. It was those medics, that generation, which has been the provider of the scientists, the experimentalists, and the communicators who have enabled the creation of a vaccine and the purchase of it, which can be used across the globe at minimal cost. Now, our government, like most wealthy nations, has set a boundary around the nation state with a UK first policy, with vaccines purchased or ordered hugely more than the doses we can ever need. Understandably, because of fear of failure of those vaccines, but nevertheless, having a huge impact on our global community. At the current rate, it will take 5 years to vaccinate every adult on Earth just once. 0.02% of the population of Africa had been vaccinated by the end of February, a figure which the leader of the African Centers for Disease Control called a moral catastrophe because of the implication that those in Africa are of less value than some others. And it was also self-defeating because it will allow new variants to emerge. Christian Aid has been trying to persuade governments to adjust their policy. And Jenner's tight-knit rural community is, of course, far from the great diverse cities and the profound influence of social media. Over recent months, as our understanding of vaccine hesitancy has developed, so it has become embedded in some communities. Until the distraction provided by Andrew Wakefield, there had been an altruistic consensus, born not least of experience of seeing people dying of diphtheria. Being vaccinated does present a risk, but that risk was regarded as part of our obligation to our neighbours to minimize their risk, to suffer, to allow others to benefit. It was, and I would argue it still is, as Her Majesty the Queen has indicated, our duty to be vaccinated if we can be. But in our generation, with social consensus, even social contract fraying, mass immunization has become a profound test of that civic duty and our ability to cooperate. Which is why the faith communities have been at the forefront of demonstrating their support for vaccination, with vaccination centres opened in cathedrals and mosques, adherents of faith training as vaccinators or offering as volunteers, and faith leaders explaining why their people should be vaccinated. These leaders have often used their family stories of the positive impact of vaccination, and what has become apparent, not least to those of us who have tried to convince the reluctant, is that facts do not convince or convict, at least on their own. This is not because the facts are seen as wrong, but the facts are seen as irrelevant. A decision to get vaccinated is not dependent for most of us on information, but on trust. Which is why I chose to speak to this Christian gathering about the Christian virtues that Jenna espoused of wonder, truth-seeking, and care for the vulnerable, which lie behind the theory of vaccination. And alongside that, the altruism and Christian neighborliness, which continue to be its foundation. So I ask you today, do continue to build community, to listen to the vaccine hesitant and continue to gain their trust. And if you are able, do contribute to Christian Aid's Thanks Be to God appeal in thanksgiving for your own vaccination when it does come. That generosity, that worldview is something that I think Edward Jenner would have understood and supported.